In the heart of the Colorado wilderness, Mike Stevens knew every mile of the isolated Highway 36. 30 years behind the wheel had taught him to expect the unexpected. But when his trusted truck gave out beneath a bleak winter sky, veteran trucker Mike finds himself stranded on a remote highway amid an oncoming winter wildfire, an unprecedented danger fueled by strange weather patterns. Alone, with a dead phone and the memory of his late wife, Mike prepares for the worst. But nothing could have prepared him for what emerged from the shadowy forest that day. A mother bobcat, 4 tiny cubs, and a desperate urgency in those amber eyes that defied everything we thought we know about the wilderness. Mike faced an impossible choice: trust his instincts as a seasoned survivalist, or follow a wild predator leading her family away from danger. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The ancient diesel engine of Mike Stevens' Peterbilt groaned beneath the crushing Colorado cold. At 53, with 30 years of long-haul driving under his belt, Mike had seen nearly every challenge the road could throw at a man. The treacherous, ice-slicked highways of the Northern Territories in winter were nothing new to him. But something about today's run felt different. Maybe it was the unusual weather pattern the meteorologist had mentioned that morning at the truck stop in Boulder. Unseasonably warm temperatures followed by a precipitous drop, creating dangerous conditions for wildfires despite the winter season. Maybe it was the eerie quiet on the CB radio, normally filled with the chatter of fellow drivers navigating the remote stretches of Highway 36. Or maybe it was simply the gnawing loneliness that had become Mike's constant companion since Marion's passing 3 years ago. As the truck labored up a steep incline, Mike glanced at the small wooden box secured to his dashboard with industrial-strength Velcro. Inside were Marion's ashes, or at least a small portion of them. "Just another day in paradise, right, sweetheart?" he murmured, a ritual that had become as natural as checking his mirrors. The first sign of trouble came with a subtle change in the engine's pitch, a discordant note that only someone who had spent decades listening to the same mechanical symphony would notice. Mike frowned, tapping the temperature gauge with a calloused finger. The needle hovered dangerously close to the red zone. "Come on, old girl." He coaxed the truck, downshifting to reduce the strain. Just 20 more miles to the maintenance station. But the Peterbilt had other ideas. The engine coughed once, twice, then gave a violent shudder. Black smoke began billowing from beneath the hood, and the steering grew heavy in Mike's hands. With practiced calm, he guided the massive vehicle to the side of the desolate highway, the snow-covered pines standing sentinel as the truck shuddered to a final, ominous stop. Silence descended, broken only by the soft tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. Mike exhaled slowly, his breath forming a cloud in the cab that was already growing colder by the minute. He reached for his satellite phone, mentally calculating how long it would take for roadside assistance to reach him this far out. The screen remained dark when he pressed the power button. He tried again, holding it longer, but nothing happened. With a sinking feeling, Mike remembered he'd meant to charge it at his last stop. Between the cold and the battery's age, it had likely drained faster than usual. "Perfect," he muttered, sliding his heavy coat on and shoving his hands into thermal gloves. Just perfect. Outside, the temperature hit him like a physical blow. The thermometer on his truck's side mirror read 15 below zero, and that didn't account for the wind chill that sliced through layers of clothing like a knife. Mike trudged around to the hood, unlatching it and wincing at the cloud of acrid smoke that greeted him. Even with his limited mechanical knowledge, he could see this wasn't a quick fix. A cracked radiator hose had sprayed coolant across the engine block, and in these temperatures, the remaining fluid was already beginning to freeze. Mike mentally inventoried his supplies. He had emergency rations, a sleeping bag rated for extreme temperatures, flares, and enough fuel to keep the cab's heater running intermittently for perhaps 2 days if he was careful. People knew his route. When he didn't check in at the next station, someone would eventually come looking. But in weather like this, with night approaching, that was small comfort. As he contemplated his options, a movement in the nearby tree line caught his eye. He froze, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was. While bears would be hibernating this time of year, wolves and other predators certainly weren't. What emerged from the shadowy forest, however, wasn't the gray form of a timber wolf but the tawny, spotted coat of a bobcat. Even from this distance, Mike could tell it was a female, smaller than a male would be, with a lean, powerful body perfectly adapted to the harsh northern environment. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, partially concealed by the underbrush, for tiny shapes moved tentatively, their spotted coats nearly invisible against the snow-dusted forest floor. "Well, I'll be," Mike whispered, remaining motionless. In all his years driving these routes, he'd caught only fleeting glimpses of these elusive predators. To see a mother with cubs, and in winter, no less, was extraordinary. What happened next defied everything Mike thought he knew about wild animals. Instead of retreating deeper into the protective cover of the forest, the mother bobcat began moving closer to the truck, her movements cautious but deliberate. She stopped about 20 yards away, her amber eyes fixed intently on Mike. Then she made a sound, not the snarl or hiss he might have expected, but a chirping, yowling call that seemed almost conversational. The cubs huddled together at the forest's edge, occasionally mimicking their mother's calls in higher-pitched voices, their tiny faces turned anxiously toward the horizon behind them. Mike remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing. The bobcat paced in a tight circle, her agitation visibly growing. She looked repeatedly between Mike and the distant forest to the west, then repeated her strange, urgent call. "What's got you so worked up, Mama?" Mike murmured, careful not to make any sudden movements. The bobcat's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she didn't retreat. If anything, her movements became more insistent, her calls louder. That's when Mike noticed the smell, not the sharp chemical scent of his truck's coolant, but something more ominous. Smoke. And not the thin, white smoke of a campfire, but the thick, acrid smell of a major burn. He turned toward the western horizon and felt his blood run cold. In the distance, behind a ridge of hills, a dark wall of smoke was rising, staining the pale winter sky. Beneath it, Mike could just make out the orange glow of flames. A forest fire, in winter. Unusual, but not impossible, especially with the dry spell they'd had and the high winds forecasted for the evening. The fire would be moving fast, feeding on the drought-stressed timber and driven by the gusting wind directly toward the highway, toward him. Panic surged through Mike's body, sending a rush of adrenaline into his limbs. He needed to move, now. But where? The maintenance station was too far to reach on foot before the fire arrived, especially in these temperatures. The surrounding landscape offered little in the way of natural fire breaks, just miles of dense forest and rugged terrain. As he quickly gathered essential supplies from his truck, shoving them into his emergency backpack, the bobcat let out another call, louder, more insistent. Mike looked up to see her herding her cubs toward a narrow game trail that led away from the approaching fire, perpendicular to the highway. She moved several yards down the path, then stopped and looked back directly at Mike. She waited, her eyes locked on his, then moved a few more yards and paused again. "You've got to be kidding me," Mike said aloud. The bobcat repeated the process, moving forward, stopping, looking back with that same intense gaze. One of the cubs began to stray from the path, and she quickly guided it back with gentle nudges from her nose, all while keeping Mike in her sight. The smoke was growing thicker now, the wind carrying it toward them in ominous dark clouds. Time was running out. Mike had heard stories of animals sensing danger before humans could, elephants moving to higher ground before tsunamis, dogs alerting families to gas leaks or fires. But this felt like something else entirely, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the divide between human and animal consciousness. With one last glance at his disabled truck, his livelihood, his home on the road, Mike made his decision. He secured his backpack, grabbed the small wooden box from the dashboard, and began following the Bobcat family down the narrow trail. "I hope you know where you're going, Mama," he said, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. The path quickly narrowed, winding through densely packed spruce trees and over rocky, uneven ground. The Bobcat moved with effortless grace, her powerful hind legs propelling her over obstacles while her cubs scrambled to keep pace. Mike struggled behind them, his heavy boots slipping on icy patches, his breath coming in ragged gasps that froze instantly in his beard. Behind them, the fire's advance was audible now, a distant but growing roar, punctuated by the explosive cracking of trees as their sap boiled and burst from within. Mike knew all too well how quickly a forest fire could move with the wind behind it. 60, 70 miles an hour wasn't unheard of. They needed to find shelter, and soon. The Bobcat family led him over a frozen creek, the ice cracking ominously beneath his weight, though it held firm under the cat's lighter bodies. They traversed narrow gullies where the wind howled like a living thing, funneled between rocky walls. All the while, the mother Bobcat kept her pattern, moving ahead, stopping to check on her cubs, waiting for Mike to catch up, her strange call seeming to encourage them all forward. Hours passed, the short winter day fading quickly to twilight. Mike's muscles screamed with exhaustion, his lungs burning from both exertion and the increasingly smoke-filled air. The ash began to fall around them like gray snow, coating their shoulders and stinging their eyes. Several times, he nearly lost sight of the Bobcats in the growing darkness, their natural camouflage making them ghostly shadows against the dimming landscape. Just as Mike felt he couldn't take another step, the forest began to thin. The Bobcat paused at the edge of a small clearing, her tail twitching as she surveyed what lay ahead. Mike stumbled to a stop behind her, leaning heavily against a tree trunk as he struggled to catch his breath. Through the haze of smoke and gathering darkness, a structure took shape on a ridge about half a mile ahead. The angular, human-made lines unmistakable against the natural curves of the landscape. A building of some kind, long abandoned by the look of it, but solid, its metal roof reflecting the ominous orange glow of the approaching fire. "Is that what you've been leading me to?" Mike asked incredulously. The Bobcat looked back at him, her amber eyes reflecting the falling night, then continued forward across the clearing, her cubs close behind. As they drew nearer, Mike recognized the structure as an old ranger station, one of many that had been built across Colorado's vast wilderness decades ago, before budget cuts had forced the Forestry Service to consolidate their operations. Most had been abandoned, left to slowly surrender to the elements. But this one appeared largely intact, its metal construction more resistant to decay than the wooden cabins that had once been common. The mother Bobcat led them straight to the door, then stopped, looking expectantly at Mike. Even in his exhausted, smoke-addled state, he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. A wild predator, effectively bringing him to a doorstep like some bizarre wilderness guide. "I'll take it from here, Mama," he said, moving past her to examine the entrance. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, but years of exposure had weakened the hasp. After a few solid hits with a rock, the rusty metal gave way, and the door swung open with a protesting groan. Inside, it was dark and cold, but blessedly free of smoke. The station consisted of a single room with basic amenities, a desk, a wood stove, shelves stocked with ancient canned goods, and a cot with a bare mattress. Most importantly, Mike spotted a radio system on the desk and, next to it, a bright orange box labeled Emergency Beacon. His heart leaped. If the beacon was still functional, it would transmit his location to the nearest search and rescue station. He triggered the device, which responded with a reassuring series of beeps and a flashing red light. Then he collapsed onto the cot, his legs finally giving out beneath him. Through the grimy window, he could see the Bobcat family settling into the tall grass and brush just outside the cabin, the cubs curling against their mother's warm body while she remained alert, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Thank you," Mike whispered, though he knew the words were inadequate for what had just occurred. The night passed in a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. The fire came close enough that Mike could feel the heat radiating through the station's metal walls, but a providential shift in the wind spared them from a direct hit. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed, though smoke still hung heavy in the air, and the distant ridges glowed with pockets of flame. Mike awoke to the sound of rotors, the distinctive whomp 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 of a rescue helicopter approaching. He stumbled outside, waving frantically as the aircraft circled once, then descended to a small clearing about 100 yards from the station. Two rescuers in bright orange jumpsuits approached, their expressions shifting from professional concern to astonishment as they took in not only Mike's presence, but also the Bobcat family still resting nearby. The mother raised her head alertly at the newcomers, but made no move to flee. "Sir, are you Mike Stevens?" one rescuer shouted over the helicopter's noise. Mike nodded, his voice too hoarse from smoke to respond properly. "We picked up the emergency beacon. Your trucking company reported you missing when you didn't check in yesterday. Are you injured?" Mike shook his head, then gestured toward the Bobcats. They led me here," he managed to croak. The rescuers exchanged skeptical glances. "Sir, you're probably suffering from smoke inhalation and exposure," the second rescuer said gently. "Let's get you to the hospital, and you can explain everything there." As they helped Mike toward the helicopter, he turned for one last look at his unlikely saviors. The mother Bobcat was standing now, her cubs clustered behind her, watching the humans with those same intelligent, amber eyes. Mike raised his hand in a small wave. Just before he turned away, he could have sworn the Bobcat dipped her head in acknowledgement. The doctors kept Mike in Boulder Community Hospital for 3 days, treating him for moderate smoke inhalation, exposure, and dehydration. When he recounted his experience to the wildlife officials who came to interview him, he could see the skepticism in their expressions. While bobcats are native to Colorado, they're extremely secretive animals, one biologist explained patiently. What you're describing, leading a human to safety, contradicts everything we know about their behavior. It's more likely that they were simply fleeing the fire along the same path you chose. For 8 miles, Mike challenged, stopping every few minutes to check if I was following, leading me directly to a ranger station with a working emergency beacon. The biologist offered a sympathetic smile. "The human mind is remarkable at finding patterns, Mr. Stevens, especially in crisis situations. You were oxygen-deprived, frightened, and disoriented. It's natural to interpret random animal behavior as purposeful, especially when it aligns with a positive outcome." Mike gave up trying to convince them. He knew what he had experienced, regardless of whether it fit into their scientific understanding of animal behavior or not. His truck was a total loss, not from the fire, which had spared the highway, but from a fallen tree that had crushed the cab as the fire created its own weather system, generating powerful, erratic winds. The insurance would cover most of it, but Mike would be off the road for at least a month while the paperwork processed and a replacement vehicle was sourced. In the meantime, he found himself drawn back to the area around the ranger station. Not to the station itself, which had been resecured by forestry officials, but to the surrounding wilderness that had partially survived the fire's devastation. Something about the experience had awakened a long-dormant part of him, a connection to the natural world that had been buried beneath decades of highways, deadlines, and the artificial rhythm of life on the road. 2 weeks after his rescue, Mike hired a local guide to take him into the backcountry near where his encounter had occurred. The guide, a Ute man named Joe with deep lines etched into his weathered face, listened to Mike's story without the dismissive skepticism the wildlife officials had shown. "Our people have stories," Joe said simply as they hiked through a landscape of charred trees and new growth already pushing through the ash-covered ground. "Stories of animals who assist humans, who communicate between worlds. Your scientists call these stories myths, but we know them as truth." They made camp that evening on a ridge overlooking the valley where the fire had swept through. As the stars emerged in the clear Colorado sky, Joe brewed strong coffee over their small fire and shared more of his people's traditional knowledge about the interconnectedness of all living things. "The bobcat is not common in our stories. That honor usually goes to raven, bear, or wolf," he explained. "But all animals have spirit, have knowing. Perhaps this mother recognized something in you, a shared vulnerability, a mutual need that transcended the usual boundaries." Mike thought about that as he stared into the flames. He had been vulnerable out there, certainly, but so had the Bobcat family. In leading him to safety, the mother had slowed her own escape, potentially putting her cubs at risk. That went beyond mere instinct. It suggested a capacity for something more, compassion, perhaps, or at least a recognition of another being's peril that transcended species boundaries. The following morning, they rose before dawn and continued their hike along a rocky ridge that had been largely spared by the fire. Joe moved with the quiet confidence of someone intimately familiar with the land, pointing out subtle signs of wildlife returning to the burn zone. Tracks in the soft ash, new shoots being nibbled by returning herbivores, the distant calls of birds reclaiming their territory. As they rounded a granite outcropping, Joe suddenly froze, one hand raised for silence. He pointed to a sheltered hollow about 50 yards away, where sunlight dappled through the remaining trees. There, nearly invisible against the mottled ground, was a bobcat, a female, her tawny coat marked with the distinctive spots and her ear tufts alertly raised. Beside her, her cubs played in the morning light, their movements still carrying the awkward exuberance of youth despite their growing size. Mike's breath caught in his throat. It was impossible to know for certain if this was the same family. Bobcats all shared similar markings, but something in the mother's watchful posture, the particular arrangement of darker spots across her face, convinced him it was her. "Don't move," Joe whispered. "This is a gift." For several minutes, they stood in perfect stillness, watching the family go about their morning routine. The cubs wrestled and pounced on one another while their mother groomed herself, occasionally glancing up to monitor their antics with patient tolerance. Then, as if sensing their presence, the mother bobcat looked directly toward their position. Even at this distance, Mike felt the uncanny intelligence in that gaze, the same knowing awareness he'd experienced during their shared journey through the fire. The bobcat rose, stretched leisurely, then gathered her cubs with a series of soft chirps. Instead of retreating, however, she led them in a deliberate path that took them across an open space about 30 yards from where Mike and Joe stood. She paused there, looking directly at the humans, her cubs milling curiously around her legs. "She's acknowledging you," Joe said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "This doesn't happen." Mike slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew the small wooden box containing Marion's ashes. He had carried it with him every day since her passing, unable to scatter the remains as she had requested. Something had always held him back, a reluctance to complete that final act of separation, perhaps, or uncertainty about the right location. Now, watching this fierce mother guiding her family through a landscape of both destruction and renewal, Mike suddenly understood what Marion had meant when she'd asked for her ashes to be returned to somewhere that matters. It wasn't about a specific place. It was about a moment of connection, of belonging to something larger than oneself. With trembling fingers, he opened the box. The ashes inside were gray and fine, indistinguishable from the ash that now covered much of the surrounding forest. But these represented something precious, the physical remainder of a love that had shaped his entire adult life. "May I?" he asked Joe, who nodded in solemn understanding. Mike took a small handful of the ashes and released them into the gentle morning breeze. They drifted across the space between him and the Bobcat family, some settling on the new growth already pushing through the charred earth, some carried further into the wilderness beyond. The mother Bobcat watched, unmoving, as Mike performed this ritual. Then, with one final direct look that seemed to penetrate to his very core, she turned and led her cubs back into the shelter of the forest, their forms gradually blending with the dappled shadows until they disappeared entirely. "Thank you," Mike whispered, though whether to the departed Bobcats, to Marion's spirit, or to the land itself, he couldn't have said. 6 months later, Mike Stevens was back on the road with a new truck, making his regular run along Highway 36. The spring thaw was well underway, turning the world from white to a vibrant green as life reclaimed the burned areas of the forest. Things were different now. He'd made changes, small but significant. He took more breaks, spent more time observing the wilderness around him rather than just passing through it. He'd started keeping a journal of wildlife sightings, developing a more attentive relationship with the land he had traversed for decades but rarely truly seen. And on his dashboard, next to his GPS, sat 2 photographs. One was of Marion, laughing by a mountain lake on their 20th anniversary. The other was a blurry image captured on Joe's camera during their hike, a tawny shape with 4 smaller forms beside it, just visible among the trees, a family of wild creatures that had, for one extraordinary moment, breached the ancient divide between their world and his. The stretch of Highway 36 where Mike had broken down now had a new, unofficial name among the local drivers, Guardian's Pass. The story had spread, as stories do in tight-knit communities, gaining embellishments with each retelling until it had become something of a modern legend. Most dismissed it as trucker folklore, of course, just another tall tale to pass the long, lonely miles. But occasionally, drivers reported unusual sightings along that remote stretch of road. A bobcat standing boldly by the roadside, watching the trucks pass with unusual intensity. Small, spotted forms darting across the road in what almost appeared to be an orchestrated procession. Strange calls echoing through the trees that didn't quite match any known predator's voice. Mike listened to these stories on the CB radio with a private smile. Some mysteries weren't meant to be explained or proven to others' satisfaction. Some experiences existed in that liminal space between the scientifically verifiable and the personally undeniable. As he guided his truck around a bend in the highway, a flash of movement caught his eye, a tawny form slipping between the trees, there and gone in an instant. Mike slowed the truck, scanning the tree line. There was nothing there, of course, just shadows and the wind moving through new spring growth. But Mike smiled anyway and tapped the photograph on his dashboard. "Still looking out for me, Mama?" he asked the empty cab. "I see you too." And he drove on through the wilderness, a man forever changed by a single act of connection that had transcended the boundaries between species. A moment of profound recognition between 2 mothers, one human and long departed, one wild and fiercely present, both understanding the essential truth at the heart of all life, that in our vulnerability, in our love for those who depend on us, we are far more alike than different.